They gave me a berth assignment and a dock number and told me the inspection would take 40 minutes. That was at 0700. It was now past 1300, and I was standing in line with 11 other liaison personnel behind a painted yellow stripe on the floor of Transfer Bay 11, waiting for the Vethal Cooperative Inspection Authority to finish arguing with itself. Brace sat beside my left boot and watched the argument with the mild, incurious interest of an animal that had seen worse things than bureaucrats. His ears were up, his eyes tracked the gesturing figures at the far end of the bay without any particular urgency. He was 9 years old, gray along the muzzle and the chest, and he had been working since he was 14 months. I had been working since I was 19. We were, between the two of us, getting tired of standing in line. The blockage was a manifest discrepancy. Apparently, the Cooperative's processing system had flagged 6 of the 7 cargo containers in Bay 11 as cleared, and could not reconcile the 7th. The 7th container belonged to a grain broker from Yunsel province named Davarin Kell, who was a small man with a large mustache and an increasingly red face, and who had been explaining the same thing to the same Cooperative junior assessor for 4 hours without visible result. The inspection chief, a Vethral official named Chavar Om, stood at the far end of the bay with his hands folded behind his back and did not participate. He was tall, the way all Vethral officials were tall, with the slate-gray plates along his shoulders and the secondary set of hands kept closed at his midsection. He had not spoken since hour 2. His function, I gathered, was to be present, to demonstrate that the Cooperative took Bay 11 seriously. What Chavar Om had brought to demonstrate that seriousness was the thing on the leash at his right side. I had heard of Vreth-class organisms. I had not seen one in person. It was roughly the size of a transport vehicle, built low to the ground, and the sound it made when it breathed was the sound of something that had learned patience, not because patience was pleasant, but because patience made the eventual resolution more efficient. The 4 Cooperative handlers on its leads were not looking at the manifest discrepancy. They were looking at the floor, 6 inches in front of their own feet. The officer beside me, a young signals lieutenant named Fenoris, leaned close and spoke very quietly. "Is that thing classified?" "Yes," I said. "What class?" "The kind," I said, "that has a classification." Fenoris looked at his boots. Brace looked at the Vreth-class organism with the same expression he used when I set his food bowl down and told him to wait. Attentive, patient, mildly interested in how this was going to go. At 1340, Chavar Om apparently decided that standing at the end of the bay had accomplished everything it was going to accomplish. He turned, said something to the lead handler in Vethal Primary, and the handlers began walking the Vreth-class organism down the center of the bay. The intent was clear enough. The intent was to walk the organism past the line of waiting liaison personnel and down toward the disputed cargo container, and for the sight of the Vreth-class organism moving at close range to clarify everyone's understanding of how long the Cooperative was willing to wait for compliance. It was a reasonable strategy. I had seen it work. The organism came down the center of the bay. Liaison personnel stepped back. Fenoris stepped back so far he was nearly against the wall. The organism passed the first cluster of waiting personnel, and the second, and then it reached the point where Brace was sitting beside my left boot. It stopped. Not a handler command, not a hesitation, a stop. The organism's forward motion ceased, as completely as if it had walked into something solid. The 4 handlers came up short on the leads and looked at each other, and then looked at the organism, and then looked at Brace. Brace looked back. He did not stand. He did not growl. He did not shift his weight, or flatten his ears, or show his teeth. He was sitting beside my left boot, the way he always sat beside my left boot, with his haunches square, and his chest forward, and his eyes doing that thing they always did, which was look at the thing in front of him, without giving it any particular credit for existing. One of the handlers said something in Vethal Secondary. Another handler answered. Their voices had acquired a quality I recognized from my 3rd year of service, from a forward operating base in the mountains of a world whose name I have since stopped being able to pronounce. When the patrol came back from the ridgeline, shorter than it had left, and nobody was ready to say why, Chavar Om walked forward from the end of the bay. He stopped 4 meters from the organism. He looked at Brace. He looked at me. His secondary hands, the ones kept closed at his midsection, had opened without him appearing to notice. I did not say anything. Brace did not say anything. The Vreth-class organism made the sound it made when it breathed, and then it made a different sound, lower and without any of the mechanical patience of the first one, and then it sat down on the deck of Transfer Bay 11. The handlers did not ask it to sit. The organism sat. It did not look away from Brace. Brace did not look away from the organism. This continued for a period of time that I did not clock because I was watching Chavarome's secondary hands, which were doing something I could not identify a word for, but which I associated with the expression on a person's face when they have just understood something they cannot unknow. Chavarome turned and walked back to his end of the bay. He picked up his manifest from the secondary assessor's station. He looked at it for a moment, then he closed it. He spoke to the junior assessor who had been arguing with Daver and Kell for 4 hours. The junior assessor nodded twice, rapidly, and went to the processing terminal and entered something. The terminal made a sound. Green. The 7th container was cleared. Chavarome spoke to the lead handler. The handlers walked the Vreth-class organism toward the bay exit at the far end of the space, away from Brace and away from the cargo line, and away from Bay 11 entirely. The organism went without argument. It did not look back. The bay cleared in 11 minutes. Davorin Kell shook my hand without knowing why he was doing it. Fen Oris said something about needing water. The other liaison personnel retrieved their documentation and moved toward the processing desk in the order they had been standing, which was the correct order, which is how these things are supposed to work. I signed the transfer paperwork at 1412. The clerk at the desk, a young cooperative auxiliary who was not Vethal and had no secondary hands, and had been watching from a corner since approximately 1340, took the signed forms without speaking, and then looked down at Brace, and then looked back up at me, with an expression I had no category for either. "Good dog?" she said. It came out as a question. "Working dog," I said. I signed the last form. I clipped Brace's lead to my left hand, which was unnecessary, because he didn't need the lead. But it was habit, and he tolerated it the way he tolerated most of my habits, which was without complaint. We walked out of Bay 11, into the transfer corridor. Halfway down the corridor, Brace yawned, jaw wide, full extension. The sound of it echoed off the bulkhead. Then he walked beside my left boot the rest of the way to our assigned berth, and when I opened the door he went to the pad in the corner and turned twice and lay down, and by the time I had taken off my jacket he was asleep. I sat in the single chair beside the door and looked at him for a while. 9 years old, gray at the muzzle, still working. I wrote the incident into my liaison log as manifest discrepancy resolved. Bay 11, 1412, no further action required. Because that was what it was. Because that was how these things are supposed to work. Outside the berth, somewhere in the orbital station, a Vreth-class apex organism was being walked back to its housing by 4 handlers who were not going to discuss what had happened in Bay 11. Inside the berth, my dog was asleep. I turned off the light.